Before we get to the meat of the discussion, like if you could go over your journey as a storyteller. You started off as a sports journalist in Calcutta. Then you moved to Delhi as a regular journalist. So if you could kind of walk us through how the move from Shillong, where you grew up, to your first gig as a journalist in Calcutta, and then moving to Delhi, how that affected or influenced or changed your work as a journalist.
Absolutely. So yeah, in terms of my journey, so I'll keep it very short, but essentially I grew up in Shillong. My family are Siletis. This is all beginning to come back into the news. So my father's side of the family were refugees from 1947. They settled in the northeastern hills. My mother's side of the family were refugees too, but they settled in Bihar. And so I grew up in Shillong. I very much saw myself as somebody from the northeast. But of course, the ethnicity was a question growing up. Growing up was amazing. Shillong is amazing. Shillong is gorgeous. Shillong is beautiful. But, of course, there was violence. Of course, there were riots. And we grew up with all this. And also, we grew up with a very strong sense of the periphery, of growing up on the edges, on the borders, and had a very, very early critical take on India and Indian nationalism. Very early on, because the choices were very simple. You kind of either wanted to join the army or you wanted to become an insurgent. These were the sort of the in the times we were growing up, 70s and 80s, and sometimes you went from one to the other. Anyway, I left Shillong. I went to Calcutta to go to a college there, and I studied there in college. I went to university. It was very challenging for all sorts of personal reasons, but I began working there in the Statesman as a sports journalist, which was fun because I did and still love sport. So that was great. And so I began there, and I think this was in 94. Neoliberalism, or what we call liberalization, hadn't appeared full-fledged in India, so you didn't get paid a lot. But there was a kind of a sense of ethics, there was a kind of sense of even challenging the establishment. And I was very attracted to the Statesman's reputation as a newspaper that had challenged the emergency, and it had this incredible standard of reporting, which one saw from the seniors. So, it is a very historical house building, and some of it shows up in the second novel, in The Surface. But, it was actually a very beautiful introduction to journalism. And I was young. I loved the idea that there's an office which runs till 2 o'clock at night. You can show up whenever there are people to basically have adda with. So that's what I began doing. And then I moved to Delhi, where I worked 2 different stints for the Indian Express. And for a long time, I worked at this magazine, which doesn't really exist, called the India Magazine, which was a very small staffed magazine. And, I took a bit of a risk in joining it. Outlook was starting up. They had offered me a job. India Today was a big magazine, but I joined this small place because I thought there would be more freedom. And we really didn't know what we were trying to do, but I think today we would call it long-form journalism or narrative nonfiction, in the sense that we didn't want to cover just politicians, we didn't want to cover celebrities, we didn't want to do short stories, short pieces. And the first big piece that I did for the India magazine, which used to be a coffee table magazine, basically for the elite, and there were complaints, a series of complaints when I did my first story for them, which my boss, Kai Friese, allowed me to do. Kai is German-Indian. And the first story I did was the kind of story I wanted to do. And basically it involved going to the coal mines of Jharia, which are today in Jharkhand, but at the time were in Bihar. And 68 coal miners had drowned from a mining accident at a mine owned by a public sector company, by BCCL, Bharat Coking Coal Limited. And I said to Kai, having read some George Orwell and some this and that, patchy reading, I said, will you let me do a 5,000 word piece on the life and death of coal miners? So, he said, fine, very low budget. So basically, the miners had, been trapped there for about 3 days. There was this rescue effort. And when this was happening, media was there, print media, television. And after 3 days, it became very clear that the miners were not going to be rescued, and all of them were dead already. The thing was the rescue operations were suspended, and all media disappeared, print and television. And I and my photographer were the only people left. And that's when the story really began, after everybody departed, because we began hanging out with the miners who had been sequestered by the company officials, but began hanging out with the company officials, began hanging out with the miners, began hanging out with the miners' children, who were often much more feisty than their fathers for understandable reasons. And so, I did this 5,000-word story, long-form journalism. And the photograph was very bad, because the photographer was also like this freelance photographer from the Calcutta slums. He didn't have he had an SLR. You couldn't use a flash on the mines underground because of dangers of explosion, so he wasn't good with low lighting. So there were complaints that you've done a cover. We don't subscribe to a coffee table magazine to see naked, half-naked, brown, emaciated men with picks, basically, which is the way the mines were being worked. They were doing it with picks and shovels in the underground mines. So this was quite seminal to my formation as a writer. And I had a lot of freedom. And I traveled in places where I didn't know, Haryana, Punjab, and I had space to write more thoughtful stories. So this is how it began. And the other thing that I began doing, which was really which was really influential as well, was in, the literary culture was beginning to, the market was beginning to boom, money was coming in, Biblio had begun to sort of run long book reviews, Indian Review of Books came out from Chennai, so there was a kind of a demand to do book reviews. And I loved books, and the logic for doing book reviews was you got a free book. So, so you wanted to read a book, books were expensive. You went and said to the editor, I would like to review this book. So you got the latest John Le Carre, and then you got a chance to write about it. So that was also really crucial. It was almost like a self-education. And so that's how I started. And then I eventually left India, and I went to Columbia on a fellowship to a PhD program, not to the journalism degree, but to a PhD program in literature. I got a fully funded fellowship, which is why I could afford to go. And I had already begun working on my first novel, which was set in the Northeast. And that was the other thing, that I was doing quite well in journalism in Delhi. But the thing that people would not allow me to write about was the Northeast. So I would keep begging my editors to post me back to the Northeast. And they were not punishing me. They were being genuinely concerned. They would say, you're too good to waste your life there. And I said, but no, that's where I want to be. So I began writing fiction set in the Northeast, because I couldn't do journalism set in the Northeast, because if you can't be sent there. So anyway, so I went to graduate school. I went to Columbia. I went to the PhD program. I wrote my first novel while in the PhD program. I dropped out of the PhD program when, to the dismay of my very lovely department chairs and professors who were, but I left. And I published my novels. I was a freelance writer for many years. So I've always operated at the interstices between a kind of reporting, sort of nonfiction, a kind of essay writing based on ideas, and fiction. And I kind of do all three still.